everybody. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. And, a very apropos topic of navigating uncertainty in these times. I think we can all agree with that based on what's happening with US tariffs. So, very much appreciate everyone being here. And we have a fantastic roster of speakers today. We're grateful they're here. I'll introduce first and foremost my colleague here at FBO. So I'm Chris Conway, CEO at FBO. My colleague Doug Alexander, who is the Vice President, Sustainability and Government Relations at Belmont Food Group. Doug is also on our board of directors at FBO and co-chairs our FBO Advocacy Committee. And with him, we are very pleased to have Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, who is a professor in food distribution and policy in the faculties of management and agriculture, and he is the senior director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University in Halifax. We also know him as the Food Professor, as he co-hosts the Food Professor podcast and appears regularly in other media and television, providing valuable and timely insights into our sector. He is one of the world's most cited scholars in food supply chain management, food value chains, and traceability. We're very lucky to have him with us. Thank you, Sylvain, for being here. Also, we have Pierre Claroux, who has had a 25-year career in economics and is currently the Vice President, Research and Chief Economist at BDC, where he leads a team of experts who analyze economic data to identify business and sector trends impacting Canadian entrepreneurs. Pierre is also responsible for providing economic analysis and advice to the bank's senior management team and supervises all marketing and industry research activities. A seasoned speaker, he regularly travels across the country to help business owners understand the risks and opportunities presented by the economic environment. Thank you as well, Pierre, for being here today. We really appreciate it. And with that, I'll pass it over to Doug to say a few words of welcome.
Good morning, and thank you everyone for taking the time out this morning. The Sesame Street word of the day is autarky. It's an economic approach defined as an effort to build alternative economic structures or to control resources for national self-sufficiency, to reduce foreign economic, political, cultural influences, and to promote international peace. Today, the program is brought to you by the support of the good people at William McKinley, LLC. So welcome to the Protectionist Support Group. We're here to support each other when you discover you're spending unhealthy amounts of time discussing tariffs. So in the quiet moments, do you hear the words tariffs, quotas, or subsidies echoing in your head? You may be suffering from the symptoms of McKinleyism. So today, Pierre has some information to help you cope with the side effects of it and maybe the overexposure to it. Today, in keeping with our events over the past year, we like to make these sessions informative and conversational. So there'll be an opportunity to post questions in the chat where Chris and I will endeavor to add them to the conversation with our two experts, Pierre and Sylvain. And by the way, congratulations, Sylvain, on becoming a syndicated radio broadcast professional. We're so honored to have you with us here today, a consummate broadcast professional, which is you're going to up our game quite a bit. And so I have a few thoughts I want to share on the current situation we find ourselves in. First of all, the America First agenda isn't about Canada. It's about America. I think we're going to learn that April 2nd, that this isn't just a focus on ourselves. This is a focus on the world and how America is changing the way it sees it. Acceptance is really important. They have every right to self-determination, and we shouldn't take it personally. It's not our right to trade with them. It's been our privilege. Things are changing. Let's accept this reality and stop the destructive words like trade war and it's a fight and even elbows up. It's just getting old. It's driving such incredible negativity. So let's have some fun, because our tremendous abilities and intellect in Canada are better used to find a new pathway forward, lower costs, improve productivity, be more competitive, value adding, and celebrate the vast resources that we have that many do not. And so let's have some fun today and make Canada first. On to you, Pierre.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you for these words as well. I'm going to share my screen, and you should be able to see my screen by now. Let me see if I can make it bigger. You see my screen, do you?
Absolutely.
Okay. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the economy, and this uncertainty is actually slowing down the Canadian economy. This is what I'm going to talk about. We're not sure exactly what will happen with the tariff, and but nevertheless, this situation is already slowing down the Canadian economy. So first, I'm going to talk about the U.S., the impact of the discussion on the U.S., come back on focusing on Canada, of course, and also I'm going to conclude this presentation by what we can do as a country, but also as businesses. How can we challenge, or how can we go through this challenging time? So let's start with the U.S. economy. What is interesting is the number of the confidence index in the U.S. is actually really slowing down. And this is important because consumers represent 2/3 of the US economy. And when they are more or less confident, well, they don't spend as much. And that's what we have been saying over the last 2 months. In January and February, consumer spending has been down compared to December. And other indication, for example, major retail stores like Target and Walmart have also indicated that their sales are down. So the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty, not only about tariff, but massive layoff, immigration discussion, and war around the world, has reduced confidence on the U.S. side, and as a result, we are starting to see that spending is actually slowing down. As you know, the stock market has been very volatile, has been declining over the last 2 months. That's also adding to the uncertainty. So as a result, we don't have the figure, or we don't have the number for the GDP for the first quarter, but a forecast made by the Federal Reserve in Atlanta is showing that the US might have a negative growth in the first quarter this year. This is surprising, because in 2024, the US economy was performing very well with 2.8% growth in 2024, best growth in any developed economy, much better growth than Canada. So this is quite a contrast compared to the growth in 2024, and especially at the end of 2024. This situation, I think, if nothing is done, the US economy is slowly going into a recession, and this situation might help us in our negotiation on the tariff. Canada now, well, you won't be surprised. There's a lot of uncertainty in Canada. As you know, the US administration said they will impose 25% tariff on all goods coming from Canada, and 10% on tariff on energy export. Well, this announcement has been postponed twice, but what was announced last week, 25% tariff on aluminum and steel, not only on Canada, but on all countries around the world, including Canada. And the big date is April 2nd, where the US administration promised to announce a vast list of tariff for every country around the world, and also for Canada and Mexico. So far, there's almost no tariff. There's only 2 tariffs for a week. But despite the fact that there's no tariff on the Canadian economy, the uncertainty is already having an impact on the Canadian economy. This uncertainty is actually slowing down the economy, and in different ways. The first one is on business investment. We keep track at BDC of business investment intention. As you can see, in October, investment intention increased in Canada. The economy was performing quite well. Interest rate was going down. Inflation was under control. Growth was coming back. So actually, businesses' intention was to invest more in 2025. Okay, as you can see from the graph, this is January we had a very different number. Actually, we had the biggest drop in the level of confidence that we have seen since we captured those data. So this is not surprising. A lot of businesses are worried about what will happen. Exporters, of course, importers who are faced with tariff from Canada as well, but also the general, I would say, general businesses are worried. So investment intention is the first data that we see that the economy is slowing down. But more importantly for the economy, I would say, is on the consumer side, because in Canada, consumers represent 60% of the economy. In our latest survey with consumers or with Canadians, we can see that people are much more worried about the economy. 61% now of Canadians are not confident about the economy. 88% are they are concerned about the tariff. So this is a really high number. And why this is important? Well, when people are worried, they don't spend as much, and this is what we are expecting. 45% of Canadians said they are going to reduce their spending in the next 12 months. We haven't seen consumer data yet, but we are expecting to see consumer spending to decline this year just because of this uncertainty. There was a survey done this weekend that 40% of Canadians are afraid to lose their job. We are starting to see it in the housing market, which picked up when interest rate went down. But as you can see from the graph, the number of sales in Canada are dropping. And this is a sign with lower interest rate, this should be the opposite. And that's what we were expecting for 2025. But this is a sign that people are concerned about the economy, even they are not, they are waiting to see what will happen before they make a move in their home. And finally, on terms of our export, Canadian export has been performing very well. We had a record number in December 2024, but of course, this picture is going to change in 2025 as we don't know how many tariffs are going to be imposed, but definitely it's going to have an impact on our export. So if we look at the job market, we can already see that the Canadian economy is already slowing down in February, and there was no tariff imposed yet. After few months of important data in terms of job creation, the Canadian economy created 90,000 new jobs in December, almost as many in January. But in February, the economy created almost less than 1,000 jobs. So we can see already that the economy is reacting to the uncertainty that we have. There's a number of good news. The fundamentals of the Canadian economy are still strong. Inflation is under control. We had a bump yesterday. The inflation was 2.6% for the month of February. But this is probably just a bump in the road. We believe that we really have price stability in Canada, and next month we should go back to around 2%, which allowed the Bank of Canada to reduce interest rate. The policy rate went from 5% to 2.75%. So that's close to the neutral rate. We are close to the lowest rate we can get. And with the fact that the inflation is under control and also that the economy is slowing down, we are expecting to see the Bank of Canada to continue to reduce its policy rate. So that's the reason why the economy has been performing well. The Canadian economy performed very well until the end of 2024. So the reason why I'm showing you this graph is, yes, the economy is slowing down and there's a lot of uncertainty and we don't know the shock we're going to have with the tariff. But at the same time, the Canadian economy is well positioned. The fundamentals of the economy are strong. Inflation is under control, interest rates are lower, the job market is good, growth was significant just before the uncertainty. So the starting point of 2025 is good. The growth in 2025 will really depend on the tariff, how many tariffs are going to be imposed in Canada. So our forecast for this year is still positive growth, 1.2% growth, which is lower than last year. So the economy is slowing down and will continue to slow down. This forecast does not include tariff because there's only 2 tariffs on 2 very specific sectors right now. So what will happen if we have 25% tariff on every goods? Well, this will create a shock to the Canadian economy because 77% of our export are going south of the border. It represents about 20% of our economy. More than 42,000 businesses in Canada export to the US. So the shock on these businesses is going to be very important. So the business who are going to be the most impacted are business who are exporting to the US, but also businesses who are importing from the US. And it's about 150,000 businesses. So we're talking about 200,000 businesses who are going to be directly affected. But of course, there's a lot of businesses in their value chain. So that's going to be the second line impacted by the tariff. So as a result, because there's going to be some job loss, we are expecting that the entire economy will slow down if this tariff on 25% on everything. Actually, our forecast with tariff, the Canadian economy will contract in 2025. In other words, we'll have a recession if we see in April 2nd tariff imposed on Canada, 25% on everything. So on this graph, you can see the two extreme scenarios. One without tariff, slow growth, but positive growth. One with tariff, well, we will have a recession. So what does it mean for the future? Well, the blue line represents the growth in the Canadian economy without tariff. The red line represents the growth with tariff. And as you can see, the economy will slow down in 2025 and will pick up again, but will pick up at a different pace or different growth than what we used to see in the Canadian economy. Nevertheless, after the shock, the Canadian economy will be able to grow again. So what can we do as a country? Like Doug said, we know we should focus on Canada, and there's a number of things we can do. We cannot replace the US market. It's the number one economy in the world. It's our number one trade partner for the last 50 years, but there's a number of things that we control. And the first one we do control is interprovincial barriers that we have in Canada. Trade over the last 30 years has been really north-south. Now it's time to look at how we can trade east-west. We have a small market in Canada. When we put barriers between provinces, we make our market even smaller. So one of the things that we really should work on is to have a real free trade in Canada. Second, we should diversify our export. Like I said, almost 80% of our export are going south of the border. And it's interesting when we talk out to our clients as businesses, we always say, diversify your client base. Well, as a country, we should do the same. It's possible. There's other interesting markets around the world. Of course, it's not as easy as exporting to the US. For example, Europe is further. They have different regulation, but it's possible to do that. A large number of Canadian companies are already exporting to different parts of the world. And finally, support local businesses. We're already seeing that Canadians are shopping more for Canadian products, and this is helping the economy. BDC has launched a week ago a $500 million program to help businesses to go through this difficult period of time. We have financing solution, advisory solution. We're here to help Canadian businesses who are facing difficulties because of these tariffs. And just a reminder that the Canadian government also launched a $6 billion program to help businesses, mostly to diversify their export market. And finally, what can we do as businesses? Well, the first thing we can do is to work on our efficiency, or in other words, work on our productivity. As you know, we have a challenge in Canada. Our productivity is lower than the one in the US and lower than most developed economies. Actually, we're below the average of the OECD country. So this is something we can do. We have full control on our productivity as a business. That's something we can really work on. We can de-risk our international activities. Of course, if we export to the US, it's a good time to look at other markets, but also for businesses who are importing from the US, because Canada has already announced that they are going to respond to the tariff imposed by the US. That means that a lot of Canadian companies who are importing from the US, they have to find alternative, other source of products in other parts of the world. And finally, what we we believe every company should do at this point is really work on their financial situation. We don't know how many tariffs are going to be imposed on Canada. We don't know the shock that will create on the Canadian economy, but we have to prepare for that. So every business should really work to make sure that they are in a solid financial situation, because 2025 is going to be a bumpy road for a lot of Canadian businesses. So in conclusion, the Canadian economy fundamentals are strong. So inflation is under control, interest rates are lower, much lower. The job market is solid. Growth has been strong at the end of 2024. So we are in a good position. Unfortunately, we don't know what will happen with the tariff and what will be the impact on the Canadian economy. Something we know is the Canadian economy is slowing down. And how much is going to slow down? Well, it will depend how many tariffs and for how long these tariffs will be imposed on the Canadian economy. Thank you, and I would be happy to take your questions at the end.
Well, thank you very much, Pierre. That was an excellent presentation. And we do have a question here, a request to comment on GDP per capita and the impact of reduced immigration on growth.
Well, we were quite worried when the Canadian government announced they're going to reduce the number of temporary workers, because a lot of Canadian businesses are using temporary workers in this situation of shortage of labor. However, with the slowdown of the Canadian economy, I don't think that would be a major impact for 2025. So it will have an impact on the demand, on the Canadian economy growth. But right now, I would say it's a second, it's not the main focus of our uncertainty. I think tariff has a much powerful impact on the Canadian economy than immigration. In terms of the GDP per capita, it's actually increasing right now, because the GDP per capita slowed down over the last few years because we have strong immigration. As immigration is going to slow down for the next few years, well, the GDP per capita is going to improve. Doesn't mean that the Canadian economy is performing better. It's just because we're not increasing the population as quickly as we did over the last few years.
Great. And I had a question which is related to, we had done a webinar for members recently on diversifying trade. And what do you think? We see Prime Minister Carney's first visits to the UK, to France. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about increasing trade with Europe. How much will these efforts be able to mitigate some of what's going on potentially with the United States? Obviously, in the short term, it's going to take time, but over the medium term, longer term.
I think it's a good option, but and it's possible to export in other parts of the world. Over the last 30 years, we had great access to the US market, and the US market is about 2 hours away to most major cities in Canada. So that was the easy export market, and we have really benefited from that. Now that the game is different, we have to look at other market. And for example, Europe is a 500 million people market, which is a very interesting market. But there's a lot of competition over there, and the rules are different. The way of doing business is different. So, I was in Kitchener last week, and a client of BDC was saying they have a location in Canada, they have operation in the US. A year ago, they decided to go to Europe, and they are selling to Europe now. But it took almost a year. So it takes time, it takes money, it takes commitment. So this is what we need to do. We need to diversify, but it's not easy to do. It's not like we just switch to another market. So, but with commitment, it's possible to diversify our export.
That's great. Thank you very much, Pierre. Any other questions for Pierre before we wrap up this portion of the presentation?
I have a
So-
question,
Okay.
Chris. Sorry to step on you there. Pierre, right now we're talking about, we have 60 billion in countervailing duties on US imported goods. And there's another 100 billion waiting to happen. Um, with the mind of elbows up and all the rest of it, what is the real value to the Canadian economy of countervailing duties, considering what President Trump has been very clear about? This is going to be tariffs on the world, and that trade with the US, he clearly follows the logic of, or illogic of, President McKinley, and really believes that tariffs are going to pay for the American deficit and lower that $2 trillion deficit that they're running. Whatever gamble he's playing, the reality is this is not just about Canada. So what is the real value of significant 25% countervailing duties by our Canadian government on American goods? What's the real value?
Well, in terms of the economy, there's no real value. And our economic models are showing that the counter tariff is going to have a negative impact on the Canadian economy. So that's the economic side of the debate. But on the political side, every government around the world is always responding with their own tariff when they are tariff imposed on them. So that's exactly what the Canadian government is doing. They are imposing tariff to negotiate with the U.S. administration. So imposing tariff on the U.S. is having a negative impact on some part of the U.S. We're a small player, but still, we are actually the number one client for 36 states in the United States. So we are an important player for some states in the United States and for some businesses. So by imposing tariff, we put pressure on the U.S. administration. So it doesn't really make sense in terms of the economy, but it does make sense in the negotiation with the tariff. Because, one final word on this, you, you know, it just doesn't make sense to impose tariff on Canada and Mexico, because actually those three economies are very integrated. By imposing tariff, the U.S. is really hurting not only the two economies, but they are hurting the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy is going to slow down because of these tariffs. So I understand what you're saying, that you might want to impose tariff to get some revenue, but actually the U.S. administration is hurting the U.S. economy. Growth is much lower today than it was in 2024. So the importance of these tariffs that Canada is imposing is just to negotiate a better deal at the end of the day.
It really doesn't seem like there's any interest other than Premier Ford at starting opening USMCA negotiations. Like, you don't really hear that other than the Premier here. It's real obvious the sooner we start USMCA negotiations, the quicker we're to the front of the line on settling and coming up with a trade deal that deals with metals and dairy and some of the things that Trump has been talking about. There was a question from Anthony Donahue before I let you off the hook here. Can you expand on current interprovincial trade barriers and how this can be corrected or adjusted? Is there a mechanism for that?
There's actually no mechanism. Every province impose different regulations and different rules. For example, it's very hard in the construction sector to build in another province, and there's a number of regulation in the many sectors of the economy. These barriers were put together to protect the job market a long time ago. But now unemployment rates are very low across the country. So there's really no reason to protect our job market. And like I said, we have a small market in Canada. It's 40 million people. When you put these barriers, you put this market smaller, and you don't, it's very difficult for Canadian businesses to be able to be productive if these markets are so small. So there's no mechanism. You have to put all the premiers in the same room, and they have to agree to make an effort to reduce their barriers for the good of the Canadian economy, for the good of the business in their own province. So hopefully there's some momentum right now. Hopefully we'll have more momentum in the next months, because with tariff or not, actually we should do that for the good of the Canadian economy and Canadian businesses. We should have a free trade across the country.
And
Doug,
depoliticize it.
oh, sorry,
Sorry,
Doug.
no, Sylvain, I was going to say, just go ahead.
Well, if I can jump in, it's one of my favorite topics, interprovincial trade barriers. I've been at this for 25 years, arguing that it was important to address. So actually, this is good news. This is some good news for our economy domestically, to recognize that barriers are our problem, and now we have all premiers looking into this. Unfortunately, Ottawa's decision to lead the process excludes food. With the exception, of course, of alcohol. It has no intention to look at food yet. But still, I mean, our lab, we actually looked at how barriers cost consumers, Canadian consumers. Each and every consumer in Canada could actually save anywhere between $250 to $300 a year on food if we were to eliminate all barriers related to food. And that's all sectors included. And because many economists, and I suspect that Pierre would agree with this, is that it's hard to argue that by eliminating barriers, you can actually grow the economy. It's not easy to do, but the reason why I've been a big fan of eliminating barriers is that you actually could foster more efficiencies and productivity, which is exactly our problem as an economy. So if you actually put more pressure on different businesses, you incentivize them to invest and become more efficient domestically so they can become more competitive internationally. And that's why I think the elimination of interprovincial trade barriers are so critical no matter what happens with tariffs.
I totally agree with Sylvain. And we have been saying that productivity is a big issue. It's a big challenge in Canada. One way to improve or to help businesses to increase their efficiency is to have a bigger Canadian market.
Yeah, I think the fans of the Quebec Nordiques from 1978 have not forgiven and don't remember that it was the Hartford Whalers that started Elbows Up. It was Gordie Howe that obliterated a Quebec Nordiques player in 1978. That's where the whole Elbows Up thing comes up. So Quebec,
Good old
please
Saskatchewan boy.
yeah, please forgive the rest of Canada, and let's get to the table and start knocking down these interprovincial trade barriers. It's so important to depoliticize this whole discussion that politics and the economy, as much as we like to intertwine them at good times, in bad times, I think it's time to let the folks who are really imposing impacts on the economy. So, Savannah, how can we, as business people, reverse this current trend of such negativity and fear and anxiety and get this economy moving east-west instead of just north-south?
I mean, Pierre actually kind of mentioned all of the things that we can focus on. I mean, diversity, looking at our portfolio of trading partners is certainly one. I mean, let's face it, when you look at North America, we've been tenants and the US have been landlords, essentially. And it made us a little bit lazy. We didn't really bother fostering our relationship with Europe from an agri-food perspective because, I mean, we had the US. Money's like water. Water will always go and take the easiest path downhill. That was the US for us for a very long time. And now we have pacts with Europe and Asia we've never taken advantage of. We have trade deals with a lot of people. Like Europe is just a fascinating scenario to me from an agri-food perspective. We actually buy for $8 billion worth of food from Europe and we sell for about $4 billion. 500 million affluent consumers versus 41. There's something wrong here. And that's why I think there are tremendous opportunities for all businesses in Canada to take advantage of some really great markets without paying any tariffs at all and without dealing with uncertainty that we're seeing right now out of Washington.
Wow. There's a
Yeah, wow.
Yeah,
Indeed. I mean,
that's
let's
a
face it. I mean, there's a shift in paradigm here, if I may. I mean, Canada has done very well in this cooperative-based order that we've had for many, many years since the Bretton Woods deal in 1944. Multilateralism was a good deal for us. Now, and I think it was a good deal for the Americans, but we now have a tenant in the White House that doesn't recognize the benefits of multilateralism and a cooperative-based order. But right now, we're seeing a shift from a cooperative-based order towards a strategic behavioral order, and that's what Donald Trump is doing. Is basically looking at assets domestically and internationally, and he's basically trying to manage assets in the U.S. I told that to Pierre when we spoke offline before this webinar. I actually think in some diabolic way, I actually think that Trump wants to make the U.S. a little poorer for a while to actually make the American dream accessible once again for a greater number of Americans that are struggling financially because of inflation and because of other things. And so it's going to be painful for the U.S. And I think I hate to say this, but I think it's by design. Like, who would want to advocate for tariffs? You got to be really stupid to think that tariffs are good for your own economy. But he's doing it, and I've always wondered over the last 3 months, why is he doing it? I do think he wants to reduce the value of assets. He wants to reduce the value of his dollar. He wants to, especially the most important thing is he wants to bring down interest rates because tariffs will actually push up inflation. So you got to do something to make sure that the Fed actually looks at inflation and interest rates the other way. And I do think he wants the cheap dollar. Right now, our dollar is at 70 cents. It's been like that for 2-3 months now. Why? Because the American dollar is getting weaker. That could be an advantage for us eventually. And those are things that we need to think about instead of just focusing on our landlord, which is Washington.
Yeah, not to focus on him, but he's been real clear telegraphing much of what's occurring. He's actually said last week there'll be, in his own orange way, there'll be a little bit of paid for Americans. That, in his terms, that was a hole in one.
And Lubnick actually used the R word and was kind of disciplined for it.
Yeah, so they know that they're
of course they know.
There was a question, not because I could just talk about the orange guy all day and it won't be healthy for anyone. So Phil Italiano asked the question, considering what we've seen from Alberta and the Premier Smith with Trump relations, should we be concerned about Alberta?
You might be able to comment on that on the political end. So something that struck me very recently is, the Liberal Party leadership contest. We had two prominent candidates originally from Alberta, Chrystia Freeland and Mark Carney, and yet they're absolutely unable to market themselves as being from Alberta because the Liberal Party has drifted so far away from, any sort of support there. I personally think that we need to show as a country more of an olive branch to Alberta lately. And Danielle Smith's comments recently, I saw her speak just a few days ago, and what she was really saying was they were asking her a whole bunch of questions about Alberta, about oil, this sort of thing. She said President Trump can have everything he wants through USMCA. So her messaging wasn't very radical, but I personally believe there were times in the past where, as a country, we made a lot more effort to include Alberta. I think the last 5-10 years, we've been lacking with that politically to an extent. Um, and it could go through a number of examples of that, but we really need to build that back up. And I could just mention as well, I do have some other questions that I've received here by email that I'll share in just a minute. But if anyone else wants to comment on that, please go ahead.
If I may add to what you just said, Chris, I mean, I'm standing here talking to you guys from my Halifax studio, and it is heated with Saudi Arabia oil in Canada because I've never been able to build a pipeline to support the Albertan economy. And right now we have oil going through the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is probably even more dangerous, trucked into our to our market right here in the Maritimes. That there's no other case to show how dysfunctional our confederation is right now, economically speaking.
You know, the 91-year-old guy a couple weeks ago said it pretty clearly, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. You know, you can use a lot of steel making pipelines. And certainly if we're not exporting steel, we should be doing this. It's amazing how our emotions are getting in the way of logic. And I think we need to, as Premier Ford has said, bring the temperature down, start to focus on what we can do. And so then what can we do to get food out of or into the or out of interprovincial trade barriers, however you want to look at it? How do we get, you know, BC wine across the country cheaper? How can we get our seafood exported through the provinces better? What, like, I know there's no mechanism, as Pierre said, but what can we do?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, we've been talking a lot about Washington and the United States, but we need to keep in mind that tomorrow, March 20th, many of our farmers will face tariffs coming out of China. Canola, pork, our harvesters with lobster. We export for $1.3 billion worth of lobster to China every single year. So absolutely, that's why I think barriers are really important, and of course it's important for all of our groups to look at other options outside. But like I said, I think the fundamentals will remain strong, as Pierre said, and we absolutely need to get companies to invest. I tour about 2 companies every 6 months in Canada. And I got to tell you, whether it's in Ontario or elsewhere, I got to tell you, I mean, sometimes I'm never allowed to take pictures, obviously, but I got to tell you, Doug, I mean, there's a lot of room for improvement. I mean, I've seen a lot of manual labor, foreign workers all over the place, and really relying on cheap labor to produce the food we need. We can't do this anymore. We have to move on and look at how we can become more productive. And that's how we're going to be able to actually consider more options beyond the United States.
Yeah, we've been talking for the last year in our advocacy committee around the declining productivity in Canada. That we spend as businesses about 12,000 per employee less than the US. They invest around 27,000 per worker. We invest around $14,000 per worker in our businesses. So clearly we're not investing. We've gotten lazy by what we'll call cheap labor. And I think we need to shift that. I think we need to start to attract investment and reverse it. And domestic investment, Canadians don't really believe in this economy. You know, roughly $2 trillion of Canadian, Pierre, please correct me where I'm wrong, because the odds are pretty good. You know way more about this than me, but there's about 2 trillion of our money invested outside of Canada, and significantly less of Canadians investing in our own country. How do we change this confidence in our own ability to manufacture goods here? We have had this long-standing history of pull it out of the ground, feed it some food, and ship it off to the US, who are about 23% more productive than Canadian manufacturers, which I find astounding that we have such good work ethics, but we have terrible productivity. What do we do?
Well, I totally agree with you and Sylvain on this. Any way you look at the numbers, we're not as productive, and that's the case in every sector. And there's a number of reasons for that, but one of the most important reason is technology. We don't invest as much in technology and equipment, not only compared to the US, but also if we compare ourselves to other developed economies like Germany, France, UK, all the OECD countries, we are below the average. So there's no reasons for that. And I think we got used to a low dollar, so it was easy to export to the US with a dollar around 69 cents or 75 cents 6 months ago. But we need to really change that, because it's first of all, we leave a lot of money on the table. Not only that this is not good for the country, but it's not good for our own business. If we're not as efficient as we should be, We don't generate as much cash flow. We don't generate as much profit as we should be. So that's the number one reason why every business person should look at their efficiency, their productivity, just to increase their bottom line. And by increasing their bottom line, they will have more resources to invest. So that's something we really should do. I think government should help as well. I talk to a lot of clients, and especially with higher interest rate in the last 2 years, has been a bit more difficult to invest. So government should really help Canadian businesses to invest more in their productivity.
If I may, I think companies need to be bold now, because I know, as Pierre mentioned, uncertainty is really forcing our economy to slow down. Both sides of the border. This is the time, instead of staying on a sideline while looking at an expansion project or looking at a new market. Focus on expanding, focus on efficiencies a little bit more. This is the time to do it, I think, and be bold and audacious. And this is what's been missing in Canada, I think, for the last couple of decades or so.
In contrast, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So I was just gonna say, we do a lot of like equipment installations, and from our perspective, we've been hearing a lot of people actually doing the opposite. Like what you're encouraging them to do is what they're not doing. I'm hearing a lot of hesitation to pull the trigger because of the tariffs coming in, and the new equipment could take 40 weeks to show up, and by the time that shows up, they could get slapped with a 25% tariff or more. So I don't know if there could be some more assurances put in place by the government that won't happen. And then I also noticed another, just going a little further down the stream, is the red tape to do these upgrades. And especially when it comes to like just upgrading the power to your facility. The amount of time it takes for transformers and to go through all the dealings with the local utilities, it just takes a long time to do all these things. So cutting that red tape and trying to speed that process up.
And Greg, you bring up a good point. That I'm hearing the same thing. A lot of companies are hesitating; they're not sure, of course, and that's why I'm trying with this webinar. I'm trying to invite people, think differently. We need to think differently about what's going on. We're starting to get some good signals out of Ottawa. The Prime Minister Carney, he's the first to have said now this week that there are limitations to the dollar for dollar approach. Finally. I mean, forever we've been hearing we'll respond dollar for dollar, showing strength, showing that we're tough. It is not a good option to go dollar for dollar against the largest economy in the world. So we're starting to see some signals that perhaps at some point Ottawa will be way more rational about their response against the Americans.
Absolutely. We think about moving at the speed of business and making decisions like that. That may be something that we see refreshing. Chris and I have talked a number of times about last year where strikes really lowered confidence in Canadian infrastructure, where in the US, the port strikes came along, boom, Biden settled them very quickly. No strike. Here, we had incredible uncertainty. Rail strikes, we had incredible uncertainty. We don't see that in the US. And it's really just having a bias for action and taking it. We need to change our culture, Greg. You have a great point there around red tape and bureaucracy. And the same thing, Sylvain, we make it hard to do business here. And then when we raise these issues, and we've done that as our organization, just listed them out. There's about 27 impedances that our business group has seen, whether it be ease of moving goods east and west, and as Greg said, you want to build something. How can we make it harder for businesses to build things? Uncertainty. The number of times you have to have pre-meetings to look at stuff, to just follow the rules that every engineer out there knows. It's crazy. How do we change our culture? It's a broad question, but Sylvain, you're in this up to your elbows. How do we change our culture to have a results-oriented but pro-bias for decision culture here instead of such conservative fear of change?
I think we have a good momentum right now because we have a unique opportunity. We don't want this opportunity, meaning the tariff, but I think the current situation will force us to create a more friendly environment because I hear that all the time as well. It's getting more and more difficult to do business in Canada, and it's governments at every level are hiding regulation difficulties, and we have to change that. If we want to be successful in the future, we really need to change that. And then today, it's a good opportunity for that because we are facing a challenge. And when
Yeah.
anybody's facing a challenge, well, that creates opportunities to do things differently.
Forever, our competitive advantage was our geography, being north of the US. I'm being completely honest here, okay? When you look at the data, it was utterly our competitive advantage. Now it has become our liability. And not just with the US, but for the rest of the world. So we need to pivot. And that pivot is going to be painful, but we need to be audacious and think differently. And so that's why, if you're thinking about pausing, if you're thinking about, I'm hearing some companies are thinking about, building in the US. Why not? Some companies are looking at using, different avenues to go to Europe. Why not? We have a port here in Halifax that is underutilized. I mean, there's so many opportunities that we can actually use. Out west, that corridor that we've never really invested in between, say, Winnipeg or Ontario to Vancouver or Prince George, we've never really truly invested in recent years to make that corridor efficient to develop Asia. I mean, we have New Zealand. New Zealand has 3.5 million people and exports for $20 billion worth of dairy products. 20 billion. Why can't we figure out a strategy like this?
Yeah, it's necessity is the motherhood of invention. I'm reminded of a project I did in the mid 90s where we were trading pork with a company I worked for with Japan. And they were complaining about cineresis where there was too much leakage because it was frozen and we were losing sales because the quality of the product. But you have to freeze it to put it on a boat to send it over there because it has to last, a month to get there.
Yep.
We found a way to make fresh pork without freezing it to get into the Japanese market that met Japanese industrial standards and literally built a plant in southern Alberta around a not terribly innovative way to manage temperatures without freezing pork, but necessity is the motherhood of invention. I think that's something that we all need to recognize, that we need to wipe out political barriers and barriers to business, and we need to develop a culture where we can get at it. And I think, how do we get more of these conversations, Sylvain, going where we can have these frank, honest conversations where Albertans can say, can we please refine our oil in New Brunswick? And people just don't go bananas and start raising their hands and saying, you can't touch supply management. Like, how do we get our hair and stop it on fire?
Well, first of all, I think we need to become honest with ourselves. And the only way to do that is by presenting good, strong data to people. And that's why we created the lab here at Dal in the first place many years ago, because we feel that the agri-food sector in Canada is flying in the dark. I work with different universities in the US, and the amount of data they have on the agri-food sector is amazing. We have nothing in Canada. If you want to know wholesale food prices, if you want to know anything about food, you have to wait months and months and months. And so we need to get better at data management and at providing data to the sector so they can know exactly what's happening. I mean, this week if you're on X, and I know that you're on X, Doug, I posted just a simple graph showing, our GDP per capita growth over the last decade. And I mean, you saw that it went viral. People didn't know that Pierre mentioned that it's actually growing now. It's true. But for the last decade, we've been laggers compared to many, many other countries around the world, especially against the United States of America. I mean, their GDP per capita has grown 20.7% in the last decade. Ours has grown 0.5%. So because of immigration. But now we're on our growth path again. But still, people need to know this. We need to be honest with ourselves, and the only way to do it is to show a mirror to Canadians. This is how we look, and it's not always pretty.
X is such a great example. So then we have some great conversations on there where it goes as far as calling really horrible names to each other and but they get it off their chest. Then you have an intelligent conversation, and quite often people settle down, they learn something. And so I think that broader, it's a good example, that broader conversation of facts and honesty and really working together. We're not collaborators in Canada. We're very so polarized.
We fall into these traps of slogans, virtue signaling. You know what I'm talking about, Doug. And like the elbows up, to me, the elbows up campaign feels good. It's good for morale. I think it's important. Like the Buy Canadian campaign is important, but it's at the end of the day, if you want to think strategically, like the US is thinking right now, you can't just finish with slogans. You got to move on from there. Let the noise do the work with Canadians, but the industry itself has to do the heavy lifting around strategy. And of course, politicians need to understand that they need to support the sector along the way. And I've been working with trade groups for a very long time, and I'm afraid to say in the last decade, it's been an uphill battle for a lot of things, provincially and federally as well. It's been exhausting. Instead of just working with industry, it seems as though we've had governments working against industry, and that's not been helpful, really.
We got 4 questions lined up in the chat here, but Sylvain, you and I could go on for hours, but you'll have a great opportunity soon with your syndicated radio show. So
you want to be invited on, eh? You want to be invited on, right?
No. I'm just giving you free airtime to, grow your audience. So I don't know if you want me on there. You've seen what I do, but so
I'll lose all my sponsors.
Yeah, I'll say, no, you'll have to keep certainly something over my mouth. So Stefan asked if the current tariffs are a violation of the current MCA agreement, what confidence should Canada have that a renegotiated trade deal will be respected? That's a great question. We're right now issuing tariffs that are technically without executive orders illegal, and there probably are illegal. What are the chances of them honoring it?
Well, first of all, this person is right. This is the U.S. shouldn't impose tariff according to this free trade agreement. But if we remember the last mandate of the current administration, we can see that after the renegotiation of the free trade agreement, there was much more quiet and there was no tariff imposed after that. So what everybody was thinking is the discussion around tariff right now was to lead to the renegotiation of the free trade agreement. So we'll see if that actually is the end goal. But I think the benefit of renegotiating is it will create more certainty around what's happening right now.
Yeah, for sure. And what can our policymakers do to amplify opportunities for investment? Investment follows the easiest place and to get the best returns. And so along with the uncertainty around are our trading partners going to honor their deals despite the litigious nature of it, what can our policymakers do to really amplify investment opportunities? So then you go to Ottawa quite a bit. Do you get a sense that there's a willingness to change to make it more attractive to invest?
I don't recognize any willingness, to be honest. I've been in Ottawa. Well, before the Parliament got prorogued, I was there like 3 times in 2 months, and it was. I think we all agreed that we needed a reset. We need a new parliament. So I think we're days away from an election, which is actually going to be a good thing. And frankly, to me, it doesn't matter who wins as long as that government has a strong mandate and that mandate has to be around growth, and of course that government will have to deal with the Trump regime. But also, I think at the same time, I think we need to start looking at how we're going to be dealing with China. I mean, so if we're dealing with an American administration that is having a tissy fit every 2 seconds, I mean, we have to look elsewhere, Europe, and to me, I mean, I know a lot of Canadians are uncomfortable dealing with China, but China is a huge country. It has great opportunities there, and we could do some great stuff. I'm going to be in Brazil in a couple of months as well. I mean, there's lots going on in Brazil. I don't know if you guys know, but it's a hopping economy. It's really doing well with agri-food in particular. And so we need to talk to these people and see exactly how we can collaborate further and see if we can, create synergies between all we've seen in recent years were companies coming out of Brazil buying Canadian companies and looking at Canada in different ways. But I think we need to really flip things around a little bit more aggressively.
Pierre, how do you think, that's great, by the way. How do you think, or Sylvain, Canada starting to work with BRICS nations will affect the US administration? I mean, there's quite a concern underlying all of this that the US dollar won't be the global standard, that BRICS have really moved that off of it. What do you think will happen if we start to trade with Brazil and China and other nations that currently the US trades with anyway?
Yeah, I don't think it's a big issue for the US. The right now the current administration is really focusing on the US. So I don't think they care so much about what Canada is where Canada is trading around the world. Maybe if we were trading more with Russia, that would be an issue. But for the other countries of the BRIC, I don't think they care that much.
So
This is a really important point that Jack is making, because America doesn't care. I mean, we're taking this very personally in Canada, but it's about, I mean, America is against the world right now, and so America won't care with whom we go to bed with. I mean, so Washington used to be our boyfriend, but basically, clearly, our boyfriend is leaving us. Let's actually sleep with other people, in a way. I mean, I think that's really the advantage here. We don't have to be concerned about geopolitics related to America anymore. At least not as much.
Yeah, and if you want a cheap dinner, a Chinese EV is certainly affordable. I think that's in these eras. Maybe, taking a radical step of dropping the 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, and everyone can drive around in their $15,000.
But this is how Canada is so terrible at geopolitics. I'm sorry, but in October we decided to actually align our tariff policy with the Biden administration, which is no longer there. To actually create this North American fortress to develop our sector around EVs and batteries. We invested about $50 billion in an industry that doesn't exist yet. And of course, for months, and you guys know this, for months, our farmers were just holding their breath, waiting how China would respond. And of course, China did respond the weekend Carney was appointed. 100% tariff starting tomorrow against canola, Canada oil, very symbolic. Lobster, Canadian lobster, very symbolic. I mean, this is how terrible we are at geopolitics, because we've never actually been strategic about it. And that needs to change, and how we actually position Canada, not just against America or with America, but with the rest of the world.
So the invitation was out there. Sorry.
I totally agree with Sylvain on this, and not only in terms of geopolitics, but also in terms of the economy. We have been really providing a lot of our natural resources directly to the US without transformation. And so now that the US is changing the rules, we are panicking. But we should really look at the world differently, but we should also look at how we transform our own resources to add some value and create economic value here in Canada before we send it. aluminum is a good example of that. We produce a lot of aluminum, but it's all really just the basic. We don't transform any of it. So the transformation is done in the US. So we provide the raw material to the US, they change it, and they send it back to Canada. So the value of transformation is not made here, it's made in the US. So not only we have to look differently at the world, but we also have to look differently on how we push our own economy and to make sure that we create more wealth here, not only providing raw materials.
Well said. Such a long time problem that we are, hewers of wood and all the rest of that.
Doug, you were asking about policy earlier, and there's been some changes in Canada of late that I think FBO members should recognize. And I've spoken about this at your events in the past. The code of conduct is real. The code of conduct exists since Monday. Karen is now heading the code of conduct. She's hiring now, and now we have a deal. It's funded, and this is if we're looking at growth, if we're looking at actually making food manufacturing much more predominant in the Canadian economy, that to me that was one solution, and it's actually happening now. Whether or not it's going to work, we still don't know yet, but it's actually happening, which is a miracle to me. 5 years ago, if you would have asked me if we would have had a code of conduct to protect the interests of food manufacturers, I would have said you're crazy. But now it exists. So there is a tremendous opportunity to, again, get people to think differently about distribution, think differently about the Canadian consumer, and think differently about the market overall and how they can actually expand and look at new segments, new product lines, things that really most manufacturers couldn't afford because they were bullied by, let's be honest, bullied by grocers. But it could continue to happen, but at least now there is some sort of protection.
Yeah, it was great to see Loblaws identify products that are brought in under tariff. I think that's great.
Well, what did you think? What did you think about the Loblaws decision to actually add a T to tariff? I saw some tweets coming from your members, actually FBO members, saying this should be encouraged. I don't know, do you think it's a good idea to actually add a T right next to the price of a product that was impacted by tariffs?
Well, we're being encouraged to, identify Canadian domestic products as consumers. We really don't know what we produce in this country. We really don't understand it. It's such an integrated economy with the US. Frankly, as much as it's offensive, what Donald Trump said about, well, you might as well become the 51st state. It's on us. It's our fault that we have totally integrated with another economy to become so dependent that the consumers don't understand what's really a Canadian-made product. You talked about,
Right.
the ketchup story from Montreal, and I think it's important that retailers put things like this is, like putting an American flag on it might have been a bit offensive, but putting just a little T on it helps domestic people. It stands for Trump.
The thing about tariffs, I don't know what Pierre thinks, but I'm concerned about the T strategy at Loblaw for this reason, because there are two schools of thoughts, okay? One way of thinking about tariffs is that, well, you'll have tariffs affecting some products and the consumer will always pick probably the cheapest option, not impacted by tariffs, okay? So consumers are going to be okay regardless of what happens with tariffs. I actually disagree with that. I actually don't think that's the case. What happens, and you guys know this, I suspect that many of your members know this, if one product is impacted by tariffs, the entire category is impacted by tariffs, because the consumers won't be looking at one price point. It will be looking at deltas between price points. Okay, so if one tomato in California goes up in price, other tomatoes will go up. They'll be the same delta, but other tomatoes will go up, and consumers are impacted. And my question that I asked to Loblaw, to Catherine Thomas, was, well, are you going to put a T right next to all of the products that have been indirectly impacted by tariffs? So that's why tariffs are so bad for consumers.
I could just add a comment about this, Sylvain. We've had some discussions internally, and one of the challenges we've had is how to define this stuff. And so we
Exactly.
looked at the Ontario made definition, and I believe the terminology they use is it's final transformation takes place in Ontario. So,
The
you know,
last
as
step
we
of
got
processing, yeah.
yeah. And so when we got further into this, I mean, it becomes used the ketchup example, but yeah, that's a great one. It's so difficult to know this and then to what degree. And so it's, you know, that's been, I think, the biggest challenge from our end is how do you really define it? And you get ingredients that are coming in some cases, and it applies to just about anything to some degree, right?
Mm.
You know, Sarah, and it can really make things confusing. I think educating the consumer of what's made in Canada is a healthy process. Um, and you're right, it's driven by price. Sarah asked about, on the other side, retailers are putting a Canadian flag hanger on US items because the peas in split pea soup, as an example, are Canadian peas, but the soup is processed in the US and imported as a finished good into Canada. It does, you're right, Sylvan. It does get very muddy, the waters. Consumer choice. How do we improve consumer awareness and consumer choice? And also, really, this opportunism that, you know, Metro said they're not going to raise prices as a result of tariffs. They're not going to accept price increases. At least that was a couple of weeks ago or a lifetime. That I think there's
Well,
some
I think they were shortening the process to 6 weeks. That was my understanding.
uh,
Yeah,
so
instead of 12 weeks.
the risk of greed is in there and certainly opportunism. So how do we educate the consumer better, Sylvan? Like how do we make sure people are making more informed decisions as to the impacts of their purchasing power? Because I think I made a note, you know, Pierre said 60% of our economy is consumers. I did write that down.
Yeah, that's right. I don't know. I don't know if Pierre has an answer,
No,
but
go ahead.
I would say that I mean, to be honest, I think the media has done a pretty good job informing the public over the last couple of months. I would say in terms of yeah, products of Canada, made in Canada, prepared in Canada, created in Canada. I mean, it gets confusing out there, but I thought that they did a pretty good job. 2 months ago, I was getting stupid questions. I mean, like for example, like I think a lot of people thought that counter tariffs were against Americans. They thought that we were going to hurt American consumers, not Canadian consumers. And now I think a lot of people, like Pierre actually mentioned that 88% of Canadians are concerned about tariffs. Well, how many people actually understand how tariffs work? Really? I mean, I think the percentage is higher now than 2 months ago. And with how we label products, I think we're in a better place now. We're using this crisis to our advantage, I think, and we've been educating the public a little bit, and I would credit the media for that a little bit.
I would agree and I think public, you know, as much as my joke about McKinleyism being a disease, the conversation that people are having around the impact of this is really the delta for change that we for years have talked about. Why aren't we, you know, refining our own oil? Why aren't we making our own this, that, or well, let's just get on with it. And I think the media can really help with that. And I think politicians need to depoliticize the conversation, which I don't know if that's possible, and really just focus on getting the job done that we've needed to do for 3 decades. That well, as Pierre said, become more value added focused and less around the easiest, laziest path we could be on to build a car, moving it back and forth across the border, find a way. And that necessity is the motherhood of invention discussion is really so important as it's time to get at it now. And what do we got to do to get the word out there? Because you're right, we're running into an election to really inform those policymakers, lawmakers, and that's what they are. They're not leaders, they're lawmakers, and they need to understand better what our country needs. And I think it's so important that we get the word out that to really help them understand what the average person really wants, needs, and understands. I think, how do we get that improved? I think you're right. The media is doing a great job, more of this, but the average person out there is so poorly informed. What mechanisms are there?
I just want to let Pierre talk a little bit. I have an answer, but I'll follow
No, go
Pierre
ahead.
on that one.
It's more you're expert in this,
Okay.
so go ahead.
Yeah, I know you work for the BDO, so you got to be, diplomatic about politics and policy. Listen, I think over the last several years, we've all been to Ottawa, and I'm just going to talk about federal politics here. We all know there's a pecking order in Ottawa. And so you got, the PMO, the PCO, Treasury, Finance, Health. I can go on and on and on, but Ag Canada, man, it's just way below. It was been way below. No profiling. It's the forgotten. Look at Cody Blois when he was actually sworn in on Friday last week. He was the before last minister to be sworn in. That is the indicator of how little importance Ottawa is giving to agriculture and agri-food right now. That has to change. So I know that in Ontario, where I used to live, when you look at the pecking order, OMAF is a little higher there, and that helps. When I was in Ontario, Kathleen Wynne, the Premier of Ontario, appointed herself as Ag Minister, if I recall correctly. And that's a sign. Those are signs that we need to get from the feds. And frankly, once you see that, it encourages the sector to be a little bit more bold and see, oh, we have a voice at least in government. And right now, the sector is voiceless.
And such a poor understanding of the consumer as to how food is processed in Canada. Every single politician refers to the farmer, and there's nothing wrong with the farmers, but we have hundreds of thousands of people working through the supply chain from transportation, storage, manufacturing, and retailing that they really don't understand. It is an industry.
Yeah.
It isn't just, you grow the beets on the farm and then they're on your plate. It is not quite that simple. And you're right.
But I would say, I mean, it's unfortunate that this cabinet is actually going to be short-lived. But Cody Blois, to me, is a good choice. He's done his homework. He's the former former chair of the Parliament Committee on Agriculture. He's been there for many years now. He understands the sector from farm gate to plate. So it is a good appointment. Unfortunately, I suspect that his mandate is going to be short-lived. And so, because we're going into an election. So, but I'm hoping that we get an ag minister with that kind of profile coming out of the election. No matter what color that person is, blue, red, whatever, it doesn't matter to me as long as that person understands the sector from farm gate to plate, especially when it comes to processing, which is the strategic anchor of the entire thing.
Yeah, it was so unfortunate during that window that you'll remember very well where Jagmeet Singh was hammering the CEO of Loblaws about food prices, and there was such negativity and toxicity around what they felt was greedflation and so on. And the reality is they weren't. They just have a large segment of the market, but the truth was it wasn't. And it really vilified retailers for a long time with such tremendous misinformation. And I think there needs to be a stronger voice, possibly a stronger voice in as the ag minister. And you're right, Kathleen Wynne was phenomenal as the combination ag minister and premier. Here we move the needle so rapidly on things with her just having that laneway, which was surreal from a Toronto-based political party to literally promote it. And maybe that's what's needed is a high profile, food, because you can't eat cars. It's not good to do. You got to eat food. And I think that's missing in Ottawa. And I don't know why it is. I think we need to have some sort of shift. And that's our voice. We have a great opportunity to bring some common sense over the next
Well, manufacturing is manufacturing in Canada has been the forgotten child. I mean, we've seen new plants in the US. There's always new plants being built in Canada or in the United States. Thousands of new plants, food manufacturing plants. In Canada, I mean, we celebrate one every year, maybe like a significant, a sizable manufacturing plant. Like in Saskatchewan, as soon as Trump was elected and he started to talk about tariffs, two major canola crushing plant projects were put on pause in Saskatchewan in December. I mean, you can tell that, like in processing, you need an audacious mindset in manufacturing. You guys are you foster innovation. That growth has to come from manufacturing. And that's sometimes Farmgate makes a lot of noise in government, makes a lot of noise in media, and that's why manufacturing has always been the forgotten child. But that forgotten child is the critical piece that Canadians need to understand, that you can't forget. You need to support as much as possible.
Yeah, imagine a well
I just add a
integrated
quick
economy. Sorry,
comment.
Chris.
Yeah, no, just I'd add a comment just sort of about the political stuff. I mean, I agree 100% that, we've been sort of forgotten child in this, and um, something we've been pushing for and has been really hard to get is this sort of whole of government approach. And I think about, like, Sylvain, when you're talking about, when people got called up there about food prices to appear before the committees, and this all happened very quickly. It's like all of a sudden everybody else in the government took notice of this, and within 6 weeks they wanted to solve it, and we're all sitting up there, and it's like, well, you know, where have a lot of these people been over the course of while this has
Oh
been
yeah,
happening? And we have great engagement with AAFC and other groups, and provincially
yeah.
we have great engagement with OMAFA and with Labor and with other groups. And the Premier's been really good, with engaging with us as well, Premier Ford.
Well,
But
Chris, I've worked with Minister Champagne when he was in innovation. He
Mhm.
was charged with the task of looking into food inflation. Brought me into this room with the five CEOs, which in my I was in the fall of 2 years ago in
Yeah.
Ottawa. It was the most awkward meeting I've ever been to. You had the five CEOs, including Galen Weston, of course, and I think they were 10 lawyers in the room because they were forced to sit down and talk to Chrystia Freeland and Philippe François Champagne to talk about food prices amongst competitors. I mean, it's just how can that be possible? I mean, it was just very awkward, very awkward. I'm happy that we're over that now. I hope we're over that. But it's just very awkward. And as soon as you politicize food inflation, you see governments making really silly decisions.
I think the more they dial in, I think Chris started to say that, Premier Ford is very involved. And you're right, Sylvain. We've forgotten about Kathleen Wynne literally interjecting herself into our industry, which was surreal at the time, and really much appreciated. And, I got to say, Premier Ford is he is like, he literally gives out his cell phone at every event and he answers. I can speak personally that he does answer and he does understand our industry very well. Chris had a great opportunity. Chris, you can share what happened in Ottawa to you where you had to change your flights. And that was an immediate recognition where Doug Ford saw this, and you can see where his energy level is escalating and his focus was on food. You can talk about that, Delta.
Yeah, I mean, we were invited to join his delegation. I was down there about a month ago in Washington, D.C. We're co-chairing the Ontario Chamber of Commerce Business Leadership Trade Coalition. So it's a great recognition for the sector, and it's great to be there. And it is getting to more of this whole of government approach, and it's tough because we have champions, like even federally, AAFC has been really good to us, and but it's getting that whole of government buy-in, and that's what I found a bit disingenuous, particularly with some of the opposition, like with the NDP and stuff. It's all of a sudden they're interested in this because the food prices are high, and um, but what we are getting now, at least provincially, is we are getting that whole of government level of interest and engagement, which is so important because as we get into this, we are the biggest manufacturing sector by employment, and we have the potential, as we all know, to be so much more than what we are. And if this is what kickstarts it, then that's great in that sense, although it's not a good situation for anybody. But maybe this is what's needed to get us to that level. But we're starting to get some of the recognition. I am also encouraged by, Cody Blois is someone who has, been the parliamentary secretary, been the chair of the Ag Committee, as you mentioned, and now as minister, has got a lot of energy and drive, which is great. And if the government changes, the people we've met with on the other side, we have some ideas of who might be in equally full of energy and drive and take this very seriously. Some of the meetings we've had with other parties up there in Ottawa. So I think we're well positioned going forward, but we've got to keep out in front to make sure that our voice is heard. And it's tough because we're in there with everybody else, as you know, with these things. Many other groups, but we're important. We're a big player, without doubt,
Of course you are. Yeah.
and people
But
don't think about us. People don't think about
you're
us. That's
just,
the challenge.
you're too modest, Chris. I mean, literally, the premier recognized, oh my God, you're here. The epiphany was food is not at this conversation. Next thing you know, you're co-chairing it. And by the way, that evening you got to go pack and get on a plane to Washington immediately. It's taken for granted. The industry isn't recognized until it's like, oh yeah, those guys. We need to have them at the table. We need more of those moments where somebody, and since that, in that moment, a month ago, lifetime ago, where the premier just went, this is the largest industry in Ontario, and it is the most important, and we're going to have the guy co-chair it. That was like 30 seconds of recognition.
That's a big win.
It is, and we need more of that. It's those constant conversations, getting to the front of the line, saying, "Hey, we're relevant, and we matter, and we're here." And maybe we need flags or something like we're here and don't forget us, because we're not recognized quickly enough. How do we do that, Sylvain?
Well, I mean, that's a good case study right there, I think, by being in people's faces. I mean, that's I'm an academic, okay? I'm just a lonely academic at Dalhousie University, and our work gets out, and it's not by accident that people hear about it. There's a strategy behind it. There's a communication strategy behind it. You foster relationships with media, with other institutions. We work with Guelph. We're with Saskatchewan. We work with Alberta, UBC. I mean, we build a network. We have allies, and so on and so forth. You can't just, so you are taking for granted as a sector, but you can't take for granted that people will pay attention to you. So you got to get out there. You just got to get out there. But by seeing, like, I didn't know about Chris co-chairing this committee. That's a win. That's an indicator you have to look for. These are the little wins you have to look for. You have to continue to be aggressive and being out there as much as possible. Like this webinar, for example, personally, I would have made it public. I would have actually allowed the public to actually listen in so they can learn about the industry. It's your business, but the more you actually have people talking about food, the better educated they are. Chorus actually called me to do a syndicated national radio show. I'm happy. Why? Because they're dedicating some time for food, so we can actually talk about it intelligently instead of having different advocates saying that we're the problem.
100%. By the way, we are going to release this as our FBO podcast. So the audio will be available. It's not going to really compete much with your very slick, well-polished show, but but I agree. I think these conversations need to be recognized, and it strikes me, 15 years ago, I couldn't understand why we would be putting our hands up as the Food Processing Industry Roundtable in Ottawa. We were trying to drive innovation, and we were looking at the Dutch and how do we move forward, because Canada's not an innovative country, and how do we move this forward? And we were talking about a $400 million ask, and they said, well, there's SRED and so on. Suddenly, the next day, so we had a huge group with the current at the time the Conservative government, and we were talking about it. There was great momentum. 50 guys in a room around a table. It really wasn't getting the message out. The next day, Stephen Harper's on the tarmac where my wife worked at the time in Oakville at Ford, announcing $255 million for some project there. We just didn't get the same recognition the auto sector did. It's changing. You can literally hear in conversations where the premier will say, the food manufacturing is the largest sector, even bigger than auto. How on earth, since the 60s, auto managed to make themselves the front of the line as the most talked about industry in Canada? They got, the prime minister to walk in and go, here's a big fat check to do something here in Oakville. At the time when we had something far more, we're 7,000 manufacturers across Canada, that 400 million would have been well spent, just completely ignored. We got to get ourselves to the front of the line, get the attention, and get the recognition with facts like Pierre has, like the conversations that you have, Sylvain. I don't know how we do this, but we absolutely need to get in their face and start to talk about, hey,
there's no other way to do it. I mean, that's what I do for a living. I'm in people's faces. I mean, that's what I do, because I think that we do good research and we have a good team here, and that's what we do. We don't take anything for granted. We publish papers in academic journals that no one will read. No one will read. Okay. So what do we do with that? How do we give a life to our studies on the carbon tax? How do we give a life to our studies on genetically modified organism? How do we give a life to studies on food inflation? And so you got to get out there. You got to be purposeful, and you need a strategy. There's the Canada's Food Price Report that we publish every year is viewed by over 700 million people. It's not an accident. You got to work at it.
Yeah, it's amazing how facts aren't out there enough.
And bad facts. I mean, this car paradigm in Ontario leads to bad policy nationally, and that's why we saw a federal government issue tariffs on China. We started the trade war with China. Okay, we started the trade war on China. So we asked for it, and now we're seeing China basically targeting our farmers, and that's due to the fact that a lot of people in Ottawa thinks that the biggest manufacturing sector in Ontario is the car industry, and that's not true. So basically, in a nutshell, we saw a very green government in Ottawa prioritizing manufacturing jobs in Ontario, the wrong ones, okay, over the environment, because they said cheaper electric cars in China is not a good thing for Canadians. We want to actually make sure that we supply managed our EV sector as much as possible so we can give low quality to Canadians at a higher price. Ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris,
So I just add, so we've come to time, and I want to say thank you very much to our panel. So thank you, Doug. Thank you, Sylvain. Thank you, Pierre. We very much appreciate it. This webinar, it turns out, I got a note here from Jason. It was actually made public, so we had 160 registrants. It's great, and I agree that, Sylvain, we've got to shout it from the rooftops to all of us. That's what we've got to do. We've got to what's the expression in media? You tell them what you're going to tell them, you tell them, and you tell them what you told them. And it's got to be like that all the time. We've got to keep pushing for recognition for the sector. And I think we are starting to get some breakthroughs. And this type of event is very, very helpful. And we really appreciate your time. And I think we had a very good discussion here. And Sylvain, we look forward to your syndicated podcast. And, so hopefully we can, if there's anything we can ever contribute.
It's on the Chorus Radio Network on Saturday afternoons. I don't have a time yet, but it's coming.
Great. Well, if there's anything we can ever contribute, please let us know. And so with that, we'll wrap it up. We got some, I see some applause emojis, which is great. Thank you very much, everybody, for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate it. And of course, there's lots we're doing on tariffs. Please read the emails we're sending out to members. There's lots going on that file. We've touched on a few things, but there's lots going on. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.